Right, I expect you're all as tired as I am, but what a lot we've heard during the 2 days. I was invited to do this session to update you on standards activities. It's a tradition of this conference, I think, to give an update as to what the key standards are doing. I reckon people couldn't really stomach a long list of new functions and new operators and new XSLT instructions and what have you. So I thought I would try and stand back a little bit and rather than give you the detailed picture, which you can find in the specs, try and give a more broad picture as to where we are. Covering those 4 specifications because they're the ones I'm most heavily involved in and because they've been developed in fairly close collaboration with each other. So just a single slide summary of where we are. XSD 1.1 became a recommendation in April 2012. I was shocked how long ago that date is. Doesn't time fly? XPath and XQuery 3.0 changed status since this conference last year. They became recommendations in April. We've been presenting them for a couple of years as being nearly finished, and some people might not have believed us, but we did actually finish. And those 3.0 specs came out in April. Then very remarkably, since the tradition is that it takes 7 years to produce an XQuery or XPath spec, we followed up very, very quickly in less than a year with a candidate recommendation for XQuery and XPath 3.1. I'm still not quite sure how that was done, but everyone was very disciplined about it. And then XSLT 3.0, we had a first last call in 2013, and we had a second last call last year. That's converging, but it's a very big spec, and it's taking its time to get the final ink dry on it. Let's stand back a little and look at the general picture. Looking over the years, there are fewer people taking part. That's something that affects standards groups generally. They all follow the same kind of curve, that you get a peak of enthusiasm at the beginning. Everyone wants to take part in developing version 1. You then get fewer people with the energy and dedication to produce a version 2 of the spec, and by version 3, it's usually reducing to a small core of enthusiasts. So that's a common pattern with all standards in all organizations, I think. At the same time, fewer new implementations, and they take longer to appear. There are fewer of them because, and they take longer to appear because people, when you're producing version 2 or version 3 of a spec, you know what you're letting yourself in for. The initial flush of enthusiasm that says I can produce an XML parser in a weekend sort of disappears when you start to realize how long it took to get the bugs out of that parser that you produced in a weekend, and actually get it conformant and get 30,000 test cases written and get your parser to pass all 30,000 test cases. So people embarking on a version 2 or version 3 know much more what they're letting themselves in for. And what's more, they also know that they've only got 10% of the market. So when you're producing version 1, it's easy to imagine that the world is your oyster and you're going to capture a 99% market share and make a killing out of it. By version 2, you know that only 10% of the market is buying your product, and they're not prepared to pay very much for it because all the others are open source. So realism sets in. The other thing I think is that the specs are now mature and stable. The vast majority of users can actually achieve what they need with the specs. The number of people who are saying, I would use the language if only it did X, is vastly reduced. There are not many X's left in that list that will make a significant difference to the uptake of the languages. Most of the things we'd like to change in the languages don't involve adding things, they actually involve taking things away. But you can't undo your mistakes in this world. You have to live with them forever. So there aren't many gaps left. And so I think when we start thinking, as we were doing last week, of what might be in a version 4, there's certainly a tendency among quite a few of the participants in the group to say, well, perhaps we ought to slow down a bit here. Perhaps we ought not to rush into a version 4. Yes, there are one or two favorite features I've got, but actually, to be honest, users aren't clamoring for those. Most of the things users need now could be done through function libraries or done through add-ons, done in other specs. We don't actually need to change the core languages much more. So I think that's the climate for thinking about where we go next. I used to show this slide quite a lot. I think between about 2000 and 2007, I was using variations on this slide in which I showed the time axis gradually shifting to the right. And on the whole, I mean, remarkably, I'm not very good at prediction. I often get it wrong. But in this particular case, I think that sort of maturity curve that I use on that graph with the standards moving towards the right has actually proved quite an accurate summary of where things were. 2007, I was showing XML and the 1.0 standards as being close to some kind of plateau of maturity. I was showing XML Schema without a version number there. I was being, a little bit behind, but also in the sunlit uplands. XQuery 2.0 and XPath 2.0, which were published in January 2007, but I didn't regard them as mature just because they were published. Maturity demands implementations and knowledge of how to use the implementations, as well as just the standard being out. So I saw them on a sort of shoulder of the curve. In this particular version, I didn't show anything coming up along behind, but we certainly could have done. I think today, one could just simply relabel what the lines stand for and show the 3.0 specs being roughly where the 2.0 specs were then. 3.1 coming up pretty rapidly behind. But the interesting thing about that chart is that there is a plateau. It doesn't just go up and up and up and up all the way. What actually happens is that another curve for another technology comes along behind. And for a conference that's looking at what's coming, we should not be looking, I think, at what's in version 4 or version 5 or version 6 of the technologies we know and understand. We should look at what the next wave of technologies is going to be. Like Fortran, these things are still going to be here in 25 years' time, but perhaps they won't necessarily be very fashionable in 25 years' time, and we will regard them as legacy. So the focus should, I think, start to be on what's the next wave. Let's look back a little bit at XSD 1.1, because perhaps that gives some insights as to what happens with standards as they become mature. XSD 1.1, everyone recognizes, I think, was a bit of a mess. Nevertheless, XSD 1.0 was extremely successful, despite the fact that it was an awful spec, and yes, an awful spec and an awful language, and very hard to use and very hard to read the spec, and you can name any number of criticisms of XSD 1.0, yet it achieved everything it set out to achieve and was very widely adopted. It did what the working group aimed to do, which was two objectives: doing validation technology and doing a data typing approach that allowed untyped XML documents to be mapped onto the type system of languages like Java and C#, as well as XML-oriented languages like XQuery and XSLT. And XSD 1.1, as the .1 suffix sort of indicates, was an attempt to patch the gaps. And it was also very successful at a technical level in doing that. I think the XSD 1.1 was well received by anyone reviewing the spec as something that remedied most of the deficiencies of 1.0 within the constraints of being a forward-compatible extension. The final push to get that finished was a diminishing band of people. 3 or 4 is sometimes optimistic. There were working groups where there were only 2 people. But got it finished, got it out, and then decided to declare victory and go home. There are currently 3 implementations of XSD 1.1, Xerxes, Saxon, and Altova. And the question now is for the user community, who is adopting XSD 1.1 given that state of affairs? Given the role of a schema technology in defining, and XSD in particular, in defining interchange standards for, exchanging financial messages between insurance companies or whatever, can the insurance industry adopt XSD 1.1 for defining its schemas in that industry, given that an awful lot of implementations are on 1.0 and are going to stay on 1.0, because the bottom line of that slide, the business case for investing in taking your 1.0 implementation forward is a pretty tough one. I'm pretty sure there are people in Microsoft who would like to and who would encourage their management to invest in upgrading their schema processor. I'm pretty sure, without having any inside knowledge, that those people will be asked to justify the case for doing that in terms of a business case. I'm pretty sure, having myself been in the position of having to produce business cases for such activities, that they will find it extremely difficult because the company's got a lot of other things to do. And even if you've got the resources Microsoft have, there are competing demands for investment and project money. And telling someone at a senior level in Microsoft who has never heard of XML what the advantages to the company are of implementing an increment on the standard that's going to cost you $1 million to do, because in a big company like Microsoft, everything is more expensive than it is elsewhere, is not an easy task. So what do we achieve by taking these standards forward? I think XSD 1.1 is evenly balanced. The jury is still out on whether it will turn out to have been a worthwhile exercise. It could still be a failure. It could turn into a success, depending on what happens. The next year or 2 will tell, but it'll be a slow process. Just because we've got the standard out, we can't assume that, and just because we've got 3 implementations, we can't assume that it's a success. Like XML 1.1, it could the fact that we've split the market into people who adopt the new standard and people who don't could actually be doing more harm than good. So it's interesting to just ask oneself those questions. Okay, more positive note. XQuery 3 came out this year. The other positive thing about XQuery is that it's still got a critical mass of people involved in the standards process and a critical mass of implementers. It's been adopted. Certainly, there's been some shakeout in the market for XQuery implementations, and some of the early products have fallen by the wayside. Certainly, the big database companies who are very enthusiastic about doing sort of hybrid XML SQL databases, they move their products forward very slowly and are slow to implement the new standards. Some of them aren't even at XQuery 1.0 yet. But on the other hand, there's 3 or 4 significant native XML databases who are implementing standards rapidly, are participating in the process. The working groups have been not attended by the sort of 30 people that used to come, but attended by 8 or 9 or 10 people. And actually, when you've got 8 or 9 or 10 people, you can make much more rapid progress than when you've got 30. That's been a pretty positive experience. It's difficult to remember that it's only the second version of XQuery. It took 14 years to get there. So a new version every 7 years. But one thing that has meant is that actually 3.0 was implemented long before it was finished. And people have been using the features. They've therefore given feedback on the features. The final standard benefits from feedback from early implementations. That's I think, something that's very critical to a standard coming out well, is that people are actually using it before the ink is dry on the final spec. And there's lots of good things in it. There's lots of incentive for people to move forward, and I think people will move forward quite rapidly from XQuery 1.0. The most significant thing in the 3.0 specs is that it becomes a fully functional language where functions become first-class objects. Here's just an example of what you can do with higher-order functions that you couldn't do with XQuery before. This is defining a sort function that can sort any sequence by any sort key. And how do you define the sort key? You define it as a function. So you compute a function of the things that you're sorting, use that as a sort key, and then sort it on. So XQuery had basic sorting capability, order by, and you can exploit that. But now the thing that you're sorting by can be a variable function rather than something that's hard-coded into your query. So you can write a function that can sort anything by anything. In fact, that's such a useful function that it's actually part of the standard function library in 3.1, but not in 3.0. So you've now got a sort function in the standard function library. But it's not just sorting, all kinds of things. And I'm still discovering the possibilities. You know, I'm relatively new to functional programming. I only started learning about it 15 years ago, and I'm still discovering its potential, and I'm still doing more and more of my programming in a functional way as I discover how powerful a technique it is. Yes, I encourage the rest of you to go up that same path, because you'll find yourself much better programmers when you master that. XPath 3 is an interesting one. XPath is a bit the poor relation. XPath has been developed by the XQuery and XSLT groups jointly. It's a subset of XQuery, and to be honest, the XQuery group aren't very interested in it. So long as it's some kind of subset of XQuery, that's fine by them. The things that have gone into it have tended to be the things the XSLT group wanted in XPath, and that's rather distorted what XPath has ended up being. There are a lot of users out there of XPath using it in freestanding context, using it with the DOM, using it with, you know, any number of frameworks. I think I mentioned Selenium there as an environment where an awful lot of people are using XPath without using the other languages. And those users have been, I think, somewhat neglected by the working groups. They need things that aren't in XPath 1.0. They're not being provided with things that aren't in 1.0. And I think the requirements of those user groups, of those groups of users, are a little bit neglected in the way the standards have been developed. The XPath 3.0 is probably rather a large language for many of those requirements. It should have been a bit smaller. It should have just had a few extra things from XPath 1.0 rather than having all the, for example, all the schema awareness probably is not needed in that environment. So I think the way XPath 3.0 has been developed as a byproduct of the development of XSLT and XQuery probably hasn't served the user community all that well, particularly the user community that's only using XPath in the absence of those other languages. 3.1. I really did not expect to be in the position where 3.1 would be at candidate recommendation by the time of this conference. When everyone said, we're going to produce an increment and it's going to be ready in a year, I said, I've heard that before. that's not the way standards groups work. Standards groups take 7 years to do things. It's a fact of life. It's a sort of constant, a gravitational constant, is that things take 7 years. But no, the group was disciplined, and it did manage to produce 3.1 within a year. There are very few obstacles now for it going to recommendation within a few months. Why did that happen? Partly because a lot of the groundwork had been done. A lot of what's new in XPath 3.1 is actually transferred from XSLT 3. So it's the XQuery people saying, oh, you've done a lot of cool things in XSLT 3, we want some of them. Let's call it XQuery 3.1. And in particular because the XQuery user community, or the implementer community, is very interested in doing JSON, and there's lots of things in there that make it possible or much more feasible to do JSON. There is a little bit of a tension that you might spot in the small print of the design of what's been done. There are some people in the group to whom JSON has equal standing to XML. XQuery, in their view, should be a standard for querying XML and JSON databases. There are other people to whom JSON is a bit more like SQL. It's something alien that you have to coexist with. It's something on the boundaries of your world that you want to import and export, and you acknowledge it's there, but it's not part of your world. It's something outside. And I think that tension, that difference of attitude, that difference of approach to the requirements actually affected quite a lot of the debate about the way that the underlying features like maps and arrays were done. So 3.1, the main thing is the addition of 2 new data types, maps and arrays, to the language, so you can declare variables of those types, you can pass those types to functions, you can return those types from functions, and you've got a new library of functions to operate on maps and arrays. There are a few other goodies as well, but those are the main thing. Other goodies, what can one mention? There's a function for parsing internet-style dates and times. There's a function for generating random numbers. A few little goodies like that, but maps and arrays are the core. And if we look at what maps and arrays do, they're primarily motivated by the need to have a lossless representation of JSON data. If you try and map JSON data into XML, you get something that's a pretty awful mess. And the overhead of using XML internally to manipulate JSON, there's a big overhead in usability. By the time you've converted it into XML, it doesn't look like very natural XML, and it's not easy to manipulate XML, and so it makes your programming quite tough. And there's also an overhead in terms of implementation costs you didn't want, largely because XML has all the rich navigation capability of all the 13 or however many it is XPath axes. You can go up and down and sideways as well as just going down. And the concept of identity, which I've put in inverted commas because there are some people on the working group who object to me using the term identity. When I use it, I mean it in the sense that nodes have identity and objects have identity, which means there's an operation to create a node that creates a new node which is distinct from any other node, which means it's not a purely functional language, because if you call the same function twice, you get 2 different nodes back, which means that calling a function twice produces different and distinguishable answers, which means it's not a pure function, which gives you a lot of difficulties in the semantics of the language as a result. Whereas arrays and maps are purely functional data structures. They're immutable. So if you add an entry to a map, it's like adding an entry to a sequence. You get a new map that doesn't affect the contents of the old map. And so they behave in a functionally very clean way that works very well with the declarative semantics of a functional programming language. The work on maps and arrays actually started as something to support streaming in XSLT 3. The reasoning was if you're streaming an XML document, you only get one chance to look at any given node in the document. And if you only get one chance to look at a node in a document, then you need to remember what you've seen. And if you need to remember what you've seen, then you need a data structure to hold that memory. And we therefore found that streaming use cases led to a need for more flexible data structures for remembering things that you'd seen during the streaming pass of a document. And that's why they were needed in an XSLT context. And then JSON started rearing its ugly head, and people saying, you know, there's a lot of JSON around, we need to be able to interact with that, we need to be able to transform between JSON and XML. And we found that these data structures we'd invented for doing streaming fitted the requirement there pretty well too. And that's when, so they then migrated over into XPath and XQuery. So XSLT3 finally, getting closer. Second last call was in October. It is a very big and complex spec. That has a number of implications. One is that it takes a long time to get it finished because there's a lot of scope for getting the bugs out, a lot of tests that need to be written and debugged. The tests inevitably find bugs in the spec that need to be fixed. So that's that whole process of getting the spec up to production quality. The working group is stretched for resources. It's definitely in the same way as the schema working group was a hard core at the end. That's true of the XSL working group today. There are two declared implementers on the working group, represented by myself and Abel Braxma, who are both here today. Altova have implemented selected features from the spec. They sort of cherry-picked the spec, the bits they like, the bits that are easy to implement. And in Altova's usual way, they'll probably end up implementing it a few years after it comes out, but they certainly haven't been active participants in the process. It doesn't seem to be the style of that company to do that, nor to come to these conferences and talk to us, which is a shame. So it's coming, it'll get there, but it's a slow process. Implementations coming along slowly as well. The main thing about XSLT3, and this affects the maturity curve, XSLT1 provided enough for 70% of users. XSLT2 provided enough for 90% of users. XSLT3 will perhaps provide enough for 96% of users. So XSLT3 is targeted at the 6% for whom XSLT2 wasn't good enough and XSLT3 is. We're dealing with an increasingly small top end of the user requirement, and it's important to remember that. What's it about? Streaming. We had a lot on streaming at this conference last year. That was originally the main focus, able to process large documents in a streaming way. The other important feature is packaging, which is about the ability to develop large style sheets in a more modular way and to manage the components of a large style sheet independently of each other. Plus lots of other bits. Maps, try catch, merge, evaluate, HTML5 serialization, which is about time. More in the area of collations, and of course the higher order function stuff, which I mentioned. So it's a big step. It's a big step forward with a lot in it, and I think people are starting to get quite a bit of value from it. But it's certainly true equally that not everyone needs it, in the sense that a lot of people are getting fine perfectly well with the 2.0 level of the specification. A couple of things still to do that the working group announced it was doing and hasn't finished. One is XQuery updates 3.1, one is full text 3.1. Both those fall into the category where there's a very, very small band of enthusiasts interested in progressing the standard. And then, you know, as someone said on the working group last week, when we've finished, we must remember to switch off the lights. So this year, will there be a standards update? Will there be anyone to give it? I don't know. What the message is if you still want anything in those standards, this is probably your last chance to say so. Because if we don't have users saying we desperately need X, Y, and Z, then I think it's likely that we'll have all packed up next week. And to use a phrase that I learned from Norm Walsh, which is a lovely positive way of saying that we're closing down, to declare victory and say we've finished, which is a good thing, because one ought to finish in the end, as we ought to finish this conference.
So we have a few minutes for comments or probably some other updates on the standards that you want to give inputs to the other crowd of the room. Okay, no updates, great. Any questions, any comments? Great. So thank you very much all. Thank you, Michael, for this